Thank you so much, Kelly. On behalf of the Mansfield Foundation and our two expert panelists, I want to welcome everyone to this Mansfield Foundation Zoom event. We're doing everything virtually these days, and one of the disadvantages is we don't get to feed you a nutritious lunch on Capitol Hill and have the ambiance of being in the Dirksen building or the Russell building or over on the House side. But the advantage, or one advantage, is that we really are able to reach a broad audience, and we're so glad that you've chosen to spend some time with us this afternoon. The Mansfield Foundation was created by Congress, and our Capitol Hill Policy Dialogue series is designed to recognize the special role that Mansfield played as the nation's longest serving Senate Majority Leader. Of course, he went on to become ambassador to Japan, and the Mansfield Foundation's mission of promoting understanding and cooperation between the United States and Asian partners derives from the service of Maureen and Mike Mansfield at U.S. Embassy, Tokyo. Ambassador Mansfield was famous for remarking that the U.S. Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. And this expression of Ambassador Mansfield has carried the foundation forward to the present day in our appreciation for the very special role of the U.S.-Japan alliance in Asia and in the world. And therefore, anytime there is a change in the leadership of those alliance partners, whether it's a U.S. election or a new Japanese prime minister, it's really good to take stock of what those changes might mean, what they might portend for the future of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but also for how the two nations cooperate in the world. And this afternoon, we have two wonderful speakers. I'm delighted to have Emma Chanlett-Avery and Shinju Fujihira with us. I won't go through their whole bios, but of course, just on the purpose of giving you a snapshot, Emma Chanlett-Avery is a specialist on Asian affairs, foreign affairs, defense and trade division of the Congressional Research Service. And she joined CRS, gosh, Emma, you've already earned your 12-year pin, but so back in 2003, through the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which is a wonderful entry point for public service in the federal government. She's also held positions in the State Department Office of Policy Planning and also on the Korea desk. She has a wonderfully diverse background and great education that included time in Japan on the Amherst Doshisha University Arrangement Fellowship. She's a member of the Network for the Future program at the Mansfield Foundation, and so glad to have her. Now, Shinju Fujihira, Dr. Fujihira is at the Weatherhead Center, where he has been since 2004. So I guess you joined the Weatherhead Center about the same time Emma joined CRS. He's been a recipient of a National Security Fellowship. He was a postdoctoral fellow with the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies, I think. Now, he's all about political science and studying of Japanese politics at Harvard. And his research examines also issues such as the financial origins of great power rivalry, Japanese politics and Japanese foreign policy, and is the author of Legacies of the Abe Administration, and also another book, Can Japanese Democracy Cope with China's Rise? Two very important subjects, which we may delve into a little bit this afternoon as well. So without further ado, to have us explore the implications of the changes underway in Japan with Prime Minister Suga, I'm going to turn first to Emma and then to Dr. Fujihira for their thoughts. And Kelly, what do we think? About 10 minutes each or so, 10 or 12 minutes?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, brilliant. Well, Emma, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to Mansfield for all the opportunities you've provided for me. I love that Montana, Tokyo, gravy train that I've been lucky enough to be a part of for a while. And the way you describe us as being in these positions for so long, I'm beginning to feel like we're moving towards like the gray-haired set, but luckily I've made a mask visit to my hairdresser, so I don't actually look that way right now. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. You've asked me to sort of go over some of the main points of this this short report that I produced after Abe decided to resign. And to be honest, Abe's resignation sort of just pushed me to get out a report that I had in development already, which was about some changes in the U.S. Japan alliance, or where I thought some of the trend lines were going. I mean, Abe was obviously in the last couple years played a really central role in keeping the U.S. Japan relationship at least on the rails. But I don't think that his resignation is the most important factor in where the U.S. Japan alliance is headed. And I'll talk about that just briefly. I mean, it's certainly relevant to talk about Suga's different leadership style, his interests. You know, what we know about him is that, you know, he's really driven more by domestic policies and not as much the focus on foreign policy. He certainly has a different demeanor about him. So it's really important, and we can, you know, Shin, I think, will be really good at outlining, you know, the different thoughts going into where he's going to take the relationship. And of course, we also know that he's pledged to continue, you know, that with the framework that the U.S. Japan alliance is the cornerstone of Japan's security. But I think that there are some other things going on in the alliance that we need to keep our eyes on, that is completely independent of the leadership, certainly at least the leadership in Tokyo. I don't argue in this piece because I'm a CRS analyst. However, present the notion. Some commentators say that the strains were sort of already present in the alliance, and the trends at least were heading in a way that those strains were going to worsen or increase in the years ahead. Those that I have identified here, most immediately, probably the burden sharing talks. Those are a little bit behind schedule right now, probably because of looking at the US political calendar, but those are due to be renegotiated. And I think in a normal situation, they would have already come to at least pretty close to their conclusion because of Japan's budget cycle. These are always contentious, of course, when you're talking about money, very contentious. But based on reports from Bolton's memoir, for example, we know that the United States was asking for maybe a fourfold increase in what Japan pays every year, which I think would have been difficult for Japan to do. And lucky Suga gets to come into place right as these negotiations are going to come up. Of course, our approach to dealing with China, while in some ways that's a theme that animates the whole alliance, you know, the U.S.-China relationship is so bad in so many different ways right now, whereas at least before the pandemic, Japan was really looking to get things stabilized, at least with China. They were planning for Xi's state visit to Tokyo, which of course is was put on hold because of COVID. But I think there are differences in approach in how we deal with Beijing. Japan, in somewhat a surprise move, at least to US observers, earlier this summer decided to suspend the Aegis Ashore program, which seemed to take defense officials here by surprise somewhat. That had been touted as one of the main ways that US and Japan were working together in the missile defense area because of North Korea's threat. So there's a lot of question marks there about what that means for which direction Japan is going to go in terms of protecting itself, whether or not that's going to be in tandem with the United States. I think that I haven't heard that a Suga administration would rethink that at this point. And then this has also led to more open discussion in Tokyo about Japan acquiring a strike capability. This has been bandied about in some corners for some time now, but it is much more front and center now. And again, this is a question of whether or not Japan is moving in a more autonomous direction with their own defense, which would be a really fundamental shift from the way that the U.S. and Japan had viewed the alliance in past years. And also because it's so topical, I do think that the pandemic has made a difference in the alliance. I mean, first, for some very sort of standard alliance management reasons, outbreaks among some U.S. troops in Japan, and particularly in Okinawa, which is always a sensitive area, and one of the sores that continues to be there in alliance management. I think that the U.S. global leadership has taken quite a bit of hit in this, given our poor response to the pandemic here. And Japan has always relied on the United States being a leader in many ways, and that's on what it bases its relationship with the United States on in many ways. And also, just I'm concerned about because of the restrictions on travel. The people-to-people exchanges aren't happening as much either. I mean, I'm having plenty of like late night workshops with Tokyo and with Seoul, but it's really not the same thing as getting together, maybe at the governmental level, maybe track two, in whatever ways. It's sort of the fabric, I think, of our relationship a lot that we do travel and get to see each other, and that at least is on hold for some time. Obviously, the U.S. election will have an impact on the direction the alliance goes, although I don't think that it's, so cut and dry. The trends I outlined, I think, will continue to be there in some ways. Obviously, the President Trump has been very openly skeptical of the value of U.S. alliances. So that has been difficult for the relationship to sustain. And also, Trump has such an inclination for leader-level engagement with other countries, and that's how he conducts foreign policy a lot. So I guess that's a question mark if Suga, that's not his jam. That could be more difficult for him if Trump is reelected. I'm happy to talk about other things like Abe's legacy if you want me to, but maybe that's getting a little stale at this point. I'll just say very quickly that I don't think that the alliance was flourishing as much as some of the talking points say, despite the fact that there was a rapport between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, and there was a stability to that. The fact that Abe couldn't convince Trump to stay in the TPP, the fact that they were still subject to the tariffs, the fact that the burden sharing negotiations seemed to be going in a direction somewhat akin to where South Korea's is. I think there was a lopsided trade deal that was negotiated. Abe's and Japan's priority for the abductees in dealing with North Korea were not prioritized in the United States engagement with North Korea. So I think that wasn't quite as tight as some rhetoric suggests. And beyond that, I think Abe's legacy to me is stability. I mean, he brought a really welcome stability. He raised Japan's international stature, but domestically he wasn't able to change the constitution as he really wanted to do. He wasn't able to get a deal with Russia on the northern territories that he wanted to do. He wasn't able to bring the abductees home from North Korea. So at least in foreign policy, I think that there's probably some gaps that were left there. I'll stop there and welcome questions and discussion, and look forward to hearing how Shin can enlighten us further.
Thank you, Emma. Just terrific, and I appreciate so much your critical eye on the Abe-Trump relationship and the Japan-U.S. relationship under Abe and Trump. And I appreciate that what you've done there in attempting to question, I think, the conventional wisdom that everything was smooth sailing. And you made some very specific observations about the U.S. withdrawal from TPP, which clearly was a blow to Abe's hopes and aspirations for the U.S. Japanese-led economic architecture in East Asia. And you also highlighted some divergence apparent even on China policy, where I think the Abe administration certainly welcomed the initial tougher U.S. line on China, but later I think became somewhat nervous about the descent of U.S.-China relations toward a more Cold War adversarial tone. And I think that's a lot of people don't pick up on that. And then you also cited the Aegis Ashore decision and other hints about Japan perhaps breaking away toward a more independent national security, national defense posture. All of these are very interesting observations, and I appreciate your bringing them to the fore. And you posit them as something that is not going to necessarily change just because personalities change in Kante at the Prime Minister's office in Japan. Great. So Shinju, tell us where Emma's got it all wrong, or how she's got it right. And please, we welcome your thoughts on the leadership transition underway in Japan.
I'd like to first thank Frank for his years of dedication and leadership in the U.S. East Asia relations. He plays such an important role. I'd like to thank Kelly Primrose for answering all my questions. And of course, I'd like to thank Emma for being part of this panel. She does such an important and interesting work, and her work is so important in terms of informing the public, informing the Congress, and informing us all in terms of getting accurate and relevant information. So I'd like to start with a paradox, which is that the language that's used in this transition is keisho, which means inheritance or continuity. The paradox is that the Suga administration is, the messaging is that they are continuing Abe policies, but we all know that these two individuals have biographies that cannot be so different from one another. And so I wanted to kind of unpack the three aspects of it. So I got about 10 minutes, so I'll try to do it as quickly as I can in terms of these three things. So this is probably pretty familiar to you all, most of you. So biographies, Prime Minister Abe is a hereditary politician. I would call him a conviction politician in a sense that he wants to tackle something that's thought to be politically impossible. So constitutional revision is a good thing. Russia peace treaty is a good example. Abduction is a good example. And that's really what drives him. It's important to note the context in which he followed the what was perceived to be a disappointing DPJ administration, and he stayed in power for over 3,000 days, the longest tenure in Japanese prime minister history. And I think within the party, he was very unique in a sense of inspiring. So he had charisma within the party. He inspired an unusual level of loyalty. And I think one main reason is because he won 6 elections. So he won 3 lower house elections, 3 upper house elections. And so that's where he developed this unassailable position. The only way in which Abe cabinet was going to end was when Prime Minister himself would say he's going to resign. That's the only reason. I think among voters, I think it was more divisive, that because he is seen as more ideological, and his agendas were supported enthusiastically by some, but not others. And so I think that's pretty much describes his time of nearly 8 years. Prime Minister Abe, Suga, the current Prime Minister Suga, has humble beginnings. We know that. He is described as a pragmatist in a sense that he wants to be a problem solver. He wants to focus on particular issues. I also have the word Machiavellian because he himself said that he reads Machiavelli and he likes to read the Prince. Okay, and given his humble beginnings, he's not a bureaucrat. He's not a hereditary politician. He is where he is, right? Because he's fought battles within the party and with the bureaucrats. And the other sort of a term that's used often is shobushi, which I don't really quite have the exact translation, but the next election, he's preparing for the next election, and he is going to win. So that's sort of his priority now. It's also important he follows the longest prime minister time, and then he was also the longest chief cabinet secretary under Prime Minister Abe. So this is a pattern in which the CCS has now kind of arisen as a very important post. So Prime Minister Abe also in the first cabinet was CCS with Prime Minister Koizumi 0506. It's a similar pattern. Right now, Suga's main goal is to win the next election. He was the right person at the right time to have broad interfactional support that was clear in the voting in the presidential election, but he needs to maintain it. And the only way he can do this is to win the next election decisively. Okay. I think there's an emerging narrative about Prime Minister Suga. So the cabinet, sort of the slogan is that cabinet that works for the people. Somehow that slogan fits him. It doesn't seem to fit Prime Minister Abe as well. And so he does have very humble beginnings. He was in Fukushima. He visited Fukushima immediately after he became prime minister. He's known to listen to a lot of people. He's known to actually have lunch with advisors 3 meals a day, multiple times through the day. So right now, I think the narrative is that he is somebody who listens. He is somebody who listens to smart ideas. He's somebody who listens to ordinary people's concerns. But this narrative is still, I think, under construction. And I think this is yet to be seen. But again, the point here is that they have very different biographies. So that's something to keep in mind. Policies, I think it's fair to say that Prime Minister Abe had big and many slogans and agendas. And so Professor Mikuriya Takashi had a wonderful op-ed in Yomiuri Shimbun the other day in which he basically said that Abe government was sort of like a whack-a-mole, that he just basically kept on throwing big agendas, domestic and international. It's very hard to keep up. So we had many, agendas, many slogans, and I think that's a fair statement. Obviously, he had passion for foreign defense policies. I think the most consequential development happened in the first half or so of the administration with collective self-defense, cabinet decision, and then ultimately the legislation for peace and security. So that is the most consequential aspect, I think, of administration. But you also had Abenomics, the 3 arrows, the second version of Abenomics 2.0. You had society in which all women shine. You also had society in which 100 million can be active. So there are other agendas, other slogans he had, but these are sort of big ideas that he put forth throughout his time. Prime Minister Suga's situation is very different. So obviously the biggest challenge right now is to tackle the coronavirus and at the same time trying to do economic reopening and recovery. And that is not an easy task. There's a question mark as to whether the Suganomics is the same as Abenomics. So there's a sense, this whole idea of inheritance and continuity, I think in the economic sphere, it's already been clear that they're actually very different. So the Abenomics macro level policies are probably inherited, but I think they're very different. So he's had this commitment to change what's called the tatewari gyosei in Japanese, so vertically segmented regulation, which led to all kinds of problems, most recently in the coronavirus with regards to disbursement of public funds to families throughout Japan. It's also very clear that he's interested in regulatory reform to trigger competition. Creation of digital technology agency. He's publicly said that the my number card, he wants that to be more like a social security number card. He wants this to be basically virtually everybody using that by the end of 2022, which I think is too ambitious, but that's a goal. It probably would be difficult, but I think as a goal, I think that's important. Lowering cell phone charges by 40%. Concerns about having too many regional banks, or making sure that there is some kind of reorganization within the sector to have more kind of restructuring. And the final thing that's noted is the inclusion of infertility treatment in the health insurance plans, which was noted, as one area. This is not a new kind of issue, but it was specifically included in his first speech, which was very important. So I think all of this to say is that I think Prime Minister's kind of way of thinking is closer to, I think it's closer, not exactly the same to the Koizumi period, that of course he worked with Professor and Minister Heizo Takenaka in the Koizumi cabinet, and his concern is regulatory reform, his concern is triggering more competition. I think on the foreign policy side, I think there probably will be more continuities in diplomacy. Again, probably be difficult to kind of, in the current environment, it's difficult to do a lot of in-person diplomacy, as Emma just noted. And I guess one thing I could say with the two photos that I have here is, I think the question basically is, can Prime Minister Suga hug President Trump? Can he take selfie with President Trump? And I think there was certain chemistry between the two, which was important in kind of managing the alliance relationship. It's very difficult, I think, at this point for Prime Minister Suga to make that move. And I think in that case, if it's going to be President Trump after the election, that's something to sort of watch, just to think about different ways in which Japan can engage the United States. If it's President Biden, it's possible that they have somewhat similar humble background, and so that might actually be a positive. So the futures, I think my time is almost up, but all of us in our mind, we have the HLR election timing. So I think if this had been Prime Minister Abe, it probably made sense to do it now. So we have the highest approval rating. It can only go down. Opposition is unprepared, and there are vulnerable seats that the LDP politicians hold, vulnerable or competitive seats. And so you do hear voices from the party that you should do it as soon as possible. The consideration is Komeito. So the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly election is coming up in July of next year. There's a kind of a political norm in which you want to have a general election. You want to avoid it for Komeito 3 months before and 3 months after the election, because Komeito likes to focus total energies into Tokyo or Osaka or other kind of big metropolitan assembly elections. And so Komeito also feels, sorry, I should have said that Komeito feels it's unprepared right now because Soka Gakkai hasn't met. Actually, they have met, but they could meet through August. And election-wise, there's a feeling that they need to be prepared. And Prime Minister Suga is closer to Komeito than Prime Minister Abe's relationship. And he's known for that. And so that's a consideration. Certainly, there's budget and tax-related laws, decisions, or at least at the cabinet level, negotiation needs to be done in the fall. That's a concern. Tokyo Olympics, Paralympics, there's a slight chance that Prime Minister, certainly wants to prepare for those two events, but those are the dates just to keep in mind. So I'll be proven wrong, I'm sure, many, many times, as I have been before. If I were to bet, so, it might happen. I think in the logic, electoral logic says, do it as soon as possible. But, my guess is sometime at the end of the year, early 2021, but we can discuss it. I'm sure I can be corrected. U.S. presidential election, Trump or Biden, I'll be happy to discuss. And then I'll be also happy to discuss longer agendas as well. So to end, just advertisement as usual. If you don't have anything better to do, please follow me on Twitter. Please email me any comments, questions, anything I got wrong. Please visit our website and a Twitter account. If you want our newsletter, you're welcome to get it and sort of learn about our wonderful affiliates for this academic year and our events. And we also have something called JPOS, which is a more political science centered event, but it's interesting. So I encourage you to take a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fujihira-san. Terrific. I really appreciate the way that you compared the two leaders and made some inferences about what that might portend for their domestic and foreign policies, as well as their ability to forge a personal bond with Trump. I've witnessed myself the importance of the personal chemistry that is a part of international affairs. And while no amount of friendship or trust at the personal level can fully overtake national interest-driven decisions by governments, it helps a lot, especially when times are tough, if there's that rapport. And I think that the Abe-Trump relationship was strong and even helped Abe to navigate some of the disappointments in the foreign policy of the United States: steel tariffs, TPP withdrawal, climate change pullout. These were not policy decisions that were greeted warmly in Tokyo, but the personal rapport and trust that still remained, I think, was sufficient to help Abe, navigate those difficulties. We already have some wonderful questions teed up in our Q&A room, and I think I want to go right toward them rather than exercise my prerogative as chair to ask a question. I may come back to some questions I have. But first, there's a question here about Taiwan. A couple of questions about Taiwan. The Trump administration has been warming relations with Taiwan, sending high-level officials, Health Secretary Azar and a senior State Department official, Mr. Crotch, visited Taiwan recently. And of course, Trump, at the very beginning of his presidency, toyed with the idea of elevating U.S.-Taiwan relations. And with China's security posture of ever greater concern in the United States and Tokyo, I think Taiwan emerges importantly as a U.S. friend and Japanese friend. So the questions are, what do you think about Suga and his approach toward Taiwan? Will the United States be pressing Japan to strengthen its security ties to Taiwan as a hedge against China? And a specific question for you, Fujihira-san, will Suga be torn between pro-China factions in the LDP or pro-Taiwan school in the LDP? So who'd like to start? Emma, maybe?
Sure, I'm happy to weigh in as I can on this. But first, just say as background, that I have a bigger report on the U.S. Japan alliance, and there's a portion in it where I go into Japan's partnerships and security relations with other countries other than the United States. And I think when I updated it with my colleague, Caitlin Campbell, a year-ish ago, I started to look at Taiwan a little bit more. And I have to say there wasn't a lot of there. I mean, despite the fact that Abe was seen as friendly towards Taiwan and more interested in engaging, the actual substance of the security relationship, at least, was very modest. And they, when there was like a new threshold they broke it, I forgot, it wasn't in terms of the level of retired military official they sent there, it wasn't enough for me to convince that was anything more than just, a one-off, let's try this. And I think that I know that the defense minister Kishi is seen as being very warm towards Taiwan, like particularly so, and has spoken about it. But I think Japan is in a state right now where they're really hedging like crazy, because of some concern about U.S. engagement in the region. And as part of that hedging, I would imagine, despite the fact that I think China is their overwhelming concern in the security realm, that they would not want to, they don't want to be that brash about developing something with Taiwan, which would obviously raise Beijing's ire tremendously. So, there can be some more symbolic things here or there. But I don't see, unless, the security landscape really changes, Japan's, Tokyo's smart enough to know that China is it's a giant in the region, and they're interested in their own survival. And I don't know that there would be enough benefit to doing that with Taiwan to offset what would be the risk.
Shinju, what about it? Is the appetite for risk-taking on Taiwan policy bigger in Washington than it is in Tokyo?
Yeah, I agree for the most part with what I might have to say. So there's actually a question that came from Owe-san, who is a distinguished self-defense force person, and he was asking about the role of Nikai-san, who is the Secretary General of LDP, and so on. My take on it is that sure, I mean, Nikai-san fully supported Prime Minister Suga to become Prime Minister, but he's not the person who decides the China policy, and so I think sort of working with China, with PRC, the big issue that the Chinese side keeps on telling Japan is the visit, rescheduling the visit of President Xi Jinping to Japan. But I think there's enough opposition within the party, as well as in the sort of public sentiment. It's not really there. And what I've been told about Nikai-san's role, he becomes very important when there's a problem in China-Japan relations. And then he can come in to kind of try to coordinate different positions within the party. And so on the Taiwan side, Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visiting. There's a scheduled visit in November, and that would follow Secretary Pompeo's visit to Japan in October. And so that's probably the right order, as Nikkei's Akita-san has stated. And so I think on the Taiwan side, in those developments, I don't really see, Japan doing anything significant or new in that sense.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Fujihira-san. That's a very concise answer. And I think that what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, I want to repeat back what I heard. That's how I learn. But you don't believe that Nikai's emphasis on improving Japan-China relations will be the driver, that it seems like Prime Minister Suga is going to keep some balance in this. And while welcoming the foreign ministry visit from Beijing will happen, presumably as part of the planning process, even to try to reboot the Xi visit to Japan, you don't expect Japan to be under Suga to be undertaking some bold new initiatives in Japan-China relations. Is that correct?
So what I would say is that I think, the Japan-China relations is really now shaped by the U.S. China dynamic. And sort of the thawing of the relationship is started in 2014, but accelerated after 2017, is really a function of the Trump administration. And I think Xi Jinping visit is I think very difficult. That's my understanding. So Nikai-san was the one who kind of softened the language to say, rather than saying that this should be stopped, which a lot of LDP politicians wanted to do, the language much softer. So it really still left the possibility open. But in general, I think Suga, Prime Minister Suga, and I think Nikai-san are pretty much in a similar direction with regards to emphasizing comprehensive nature of China-Japan relations, business interests in China as well.
Thank you. That's very clear. We're joined by Professor Ezra Vogel, your colleague. And I would like to ask Kelly if we could unmute Dr. Vogel so that he could pose his question directly, if he's willing. He has a question about Japanese foreign policy and the extent to which Japan may chart a more independent course, but I would allow him to elaborate on it. Ezra?
Thanks a lot, Frank. I think it's a great symposium, and we're very appreciative that, Frank, you've gotten Emma and Shin to take part in this. The question I have is whether Suga, who's done such a good job of managing domestic things under Prime Minister Abe, has the kind of independence and understanding of foreign relations and the ability to deal with foreign leaders so that Japan can begin to take a more a larger role in international relations, somewhat more independent from the United States. And if he's not able to do that much, how will two young independent stars, Konotaro and Shinjiro Koizumi, fare under Suga? Will they be given more responsibilities so they can be prepared to take a bigger role for Japan in the future?
Thanks for that question, Ezra. Shinju and then Emma.
Okay. Thank you, Ezra, for attending, first of all. It's really great that you take so much time out of your schedule often to support all of us. First of all, I think we should ask Ezra what he thinks, because he probably knows much more about the question that he asked than any of us on the screen. I think, so it's announced today that the first countries that Prime Minister Suga will visit will be Vietnam and Indonesia. Vietnam is the chair of ASEAN this year. And that's also, by the way, the two countries that Prime Minister Abe visited when his term, second cabinet, began in 2012. So that's very significant. But I think a focus on Asia Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific kind of concept, and the emphasis on that. So that's literally following sort of Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy. He had a phone call with President Xi Jinping as well, and with President Moon Jae-in. So this is really sort of the beginning. He's met Vice President Mike Pence. He's met Secretary of State Pompeo. And so it's true that he has much more experience in domestic politics policy. But I think one thing to note with regards to Minister Kono and also Koizumi Shinjiro-san, Minister Koizumi Shinjiro, is that I think foreign policy these days are made by the Prime Minister. That I think it's actually hard to be the foreign minister and defense minister and has his or her own sort of ideas to push. That I think it's much more centralized, and that was certainly the case with regards to Prime Minister Abe. And given that CCS Suga at the time controlled and kind of centralized a lot of policymaking, that's what I expected to happen as well.
Fascinating observation, a little window into the bureaucracy of the Kante and how it has taken a hold of the national security apparatus under Abe, with the National Security Council and with the chief cabinet secretary playing a larger role. As an institutionalist, I really appreciate that observation. Emma, you want to add something there?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and of course want to echo Shin as well in thanking Ezra for tuning in today and for obviously years and years of helping future generations, including ours, be in this field. We really appreciate it. This is all sort of guesswork, I think, in terms of Suga right now, because he is new as a leader. But I guess he hasn't barely traveled overseas, right, or did so very little, at least as chief cabinet secretary. But maybe the fact that he is cut from a different cloth than Abe, at least in terms of having a very humble background and a different leadership style, perhaps could be helpful in some of these relationships too. I mean,
Oh, Emma might have frozen, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we'll let her internet refresh. And building off.
He was really interested in leaders of a particular type, the sort of strongmen types, right? And you may even include Trump in that, but Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, those are the kind of guys who he seemed to really relish being on a stage with and engaging with and developing a relationship. Maybe Suga has a different approach and can forge some relationships with other countries that come from more of a democratic background. I am not optimistic that things in the short term will get better with Seoul. There's just so many obstacles there in the relationship, and I imagine even if Suga was inclined to reach out to Moon Jae-in that he would take hits domestically that he may not want to at this point. But I think that it's clear that without, assigning blame or putting your finger on the scale in any way, that Seoul had a particular distrust of Abe, given some of his background, some of the statements he'd made in the past. So maybe, if Suga has some sort of lasting tenure in that position, we can move towards a bit more of a stable relationship with Seoul, which would, of course, be in the United States' interest as well. On the young leaders, I think Shin is better positioned to comment on this, but it seems like people thought that Kono got a little demoted in this cabinet shuffle. And for Koizumi, this is just a side thing, but my husband happens to work in the climate realm. And Japan's been sort of in the doghouse in the climate world for a while because of their coal policies. And when Koizumi first became environmental minister, he was sort of mocked roundly at these international climate fora. But he's actually seen as being really effective in that position. And some of the recent coal financing initiatives, I don't know a lot about, that have been announced. So he's getting some love from that community and seen as effective for what it's worth.
A good segue from on this foreign policy decision about Suga and his first trip to Vietnam and Indonesia. I have a question from Hisano-san that plays off of your observation, Emma, that maybe Suga would be more inclined to work with democratic regimes than the attraction that seemed to exist between Abe and some of the more strongman regimes in Asia, Duterte. And the question from Hisano-san about the Quad. We don't hear a lot about the Quad these days, this notion of India, Australia, Japan, the US, forming something meaningful as a multilateral organization beyond the TPP element where Australia is a part of TPP, but can there be a Quad in Suga's future, or is this a notion that is going to lie fallow unless picked up in a serious way by the United States? I guess my question shows my own prejudice, which is that I believe that it's an idea that doesn't have a lot of momentum at the moment. But would either of you like to weigh in on this notion about the Quad and whether it has a future as a security structure in Prime Minister Suga's concept of Japan's security interests?
I'm happy to, and I'm often sort of the grumpy person in the room when it comes to this. You notice that in my introductory remarks, I didn't even mention the free and open Indo-Pacific, right? This whole FOIP concept, it was a feather in Abe's cap that Trump sort of adopted it, but to my mind, it has been under-resourced, and because it wasn't undergirded by trying to build up alliances to be stronger, wasn't effective as a strategy. And to me, the Quad is sort of like, it's supposed to, ideally, it's like the operational aspect, right, of the Indo-Pacific approach. But the fact that, Japan and Australia have real security cooperation. I think that's very established, and it has some real substance to it. Particularly under Abe, there was a lot of reaching out to India. Abe had a particular affection, I think, for India for historical reasons and otherwise. But when I think it was India would not allow Australia to come into the trilateral Malabar naval exercises. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? These are established trilateral exercises. It would have been very easy if you want to just put a Quad label on it to have Australia come into it. But they couldn't get to that. So to me, that shows there's some lack of enthusiasm for that framework in some or a few of the capitals. I think that the Quad initially was very organic. It was, I think, formed mostly in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami and earthquake. And those countries just seemed to work together really well, those four countries, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, because of their naval strengths or whatever. So that was promising. But I think since then, we've just seen some sort of, not top level meetings to make that more of a thing. But again, I'm always, the skeptic when it comes to the Quad's promise.
Thanks, Emma. And we have an evergreen question, which is on Okinawa and base realignment. I remember vividly conversations with one military attaché after another from the Japanese embassy starting in about 1990 until the present day, wondering when and if Futenma would ever be closed, when and if Futenma replacement facilities would ever be constructed and made operational. But are there tea leaves we can read about the political challenges of navigating national and Okinawa politics to achieve base realignment on Okinawa? Will Suga be more successful in winning domestic Okinawan political acquiescence to the base realignment plan than was Abe? Shin?
So I'm just going to, again, identify the person who asked the question is from, he's my colleague and excellent scholar, Professor Kuvo, who probably knows much more about this than any of us here. So I was just checking my notes as I saw his question. This is a tough one. It hasn't quite come up in my sort of interviews last week. Prime Minister Suga, CCS, visited Okinawa, and I think he sort of faced some animosity naturally there when he visited. So that's a factor to consider. But I think this is where you have continuity with Abe government, or basically this is an issue that we've had very, very difficult issues for the last quarter century, and that's I think likely to continue.
Thanks very much. Ben Self has a question. Kelly, can we unmute Vice President of the Mansfield Foundation, Benjamin Self, and allow him to ask a question?
I hope you can hear me. Hi, guys. Thanks so much. Always wonderful to see you, and really appreciate your contributions to the Mansfield Foundation. I was asking about a debate I perceived on how Asians view Biden. And the argument is that Asians see Biden as too pro-China. They hearken back to the Obama administration and what they saw as an excessively soft Obama approach to China. And therefore, they conclude that Biden going forward would also be soft on China, and they don't want that. And I think maybe this is a mischaracterization of the depth of perception within Asia and in Japan in particular. But there was an article by an anonymous MOFA diplomat saying that Trump was better. So I'm wondering whether you agree that the Japanese, having worked out how to live with Trump, think that it's better going forward because at least, they don't face the potential of a second Nixon shock type of betrayal where the US cuts some deal with the Chinese and cuts Japan out? Or would Japan be more comfortable if the US re-engaged with the traditional diplomatic model of, global institutions rather than transactional diplomacy and so on? I'd love your views on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Shinju.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Ben. Thanks for participating. Good to hear your voice. Wish I could see you, the image, but anyway. So, Glenn Fukushima has had a series of articles about how Japan, prefers Republicans, and my response has always been Trump transformed Republican Party. It's not an old Republican Party. But anyway, what I heard in my interviews is as follows, which is Trump says things that are very confrontational towards China that they wish they could say, but they just like Trump's confrontational style. And then when I ask, well, what about he's even tougher on the alliances? And then they sort of, then their answer kind of becomes a little bit, so they acknowledge that. So I think in general, I think, the government ministries are preparing for both scenarios. They're studying, U.S. election system and the electoral college and everything else. But I did get a sense, I think it's unjustified in many ways, that there is we all know this, but the reference to, Susan Rice's speech at Georgetown. And so there's sort of this, thinking that there would be this return of so this is just kind of a language, officials who may be pro-China along those lines. There's a very interesting article that probably most of us have read about Joe Biden in China in the New York Times, which, how he sort of, approached China and how his views have evolved over time. And Frank is, you're welcome to comment on that as well. But I think there certainly is that perception that exists, and it's to me puzzling.
It's puzzling to me too, because while Senator Biden was consistent in his desire to see China integrated into the global community, there was always a bit of an edge to his position, which was that this was a China that was expected to play by the rules, play by the international rules of trade and non-proliferation and security and human rights, and that China's performance over time, if it exhibited a trend line toward adherence to those international norms, that the U.S. would be very encouraging and welcoming and facilitating of China's integration. But that to the extent that China refused to play by the rules or broke the rules or tried to rewrite the rules fundamentally, that they were going to run into some rather stiff opposition from the United States and other like-minded countries. So I think that Biden's position was rather mainstream in this regard. And he certainly has hardened his views of China somewhat as China's behavior has changed in recent years. And he's always attached a high priority on alliance management and alliance relationships. So that should be somewhat reassuring to the Japanese audience, that if Senator Biden were to prevail in November, that his attachment to alliances should provide Japan with some solace that the United States was not going to jeopardize Japan's security interests or other interests in the pursuit of a better relationship with Beijing. But I think that the doubt does persist. I think there is. I think it may be linked even to other Democratic Party positions, especially in the past with organized labor and trade friction, where the Democrats were perceived to be less inclined to adopt policies that Japan wanted than were some Republican administrations. So there might be some conflation of a general preference for Republicans. It may not be directly attributable to the security issue. We are almost out of time. Our hour has flown by. I want to turn to both of our speakers for any closing thoughts. Perhaps to speculate briefly about how Suga might get along with Joe Biden if, in fact, Biden prevails, and any other closing observations you would like to offer before we adjourn. And I'll let Emma have the last word, but so I'll turn to you first, Fujihira-san.
Okay, thanks, Frank, and thank you everyone for participating. I think I'll just end by saying, I think the next election, Prime Minister Suga wants to fight and win in his own terms, that he wants his own policy record, that he wants to have done a good job on coronavirus and also the economy. And that is the only way in which he can have a decisive victory in the LDP presidential election in September. And so that is his priority. So Prime Minister Abe proved that if you keep on winning elections, then he can be a prime minister and the LDP president for a long time. But I think there's that kind of a tension between having a relatively short time. We know that it has to happen before October 21st next year, but also building a policy record on coronavirus, economy. There's just a lot of uncertainties plus the kind of incentives for LDP parliamentarians wanting an earlier election given the very high ratings right now. So that's the domestic political dynamic that I think we'll see.
Thank you so much, Shinju. It's a good way to sum up that with Prime Minister Suga, we have a man who wants to be Prime Minister perhaps for a long time. He's served there under Abe. He's seen what can be accomplished when you have some stability and longevity in the office, and that this is not just a caretaker government, but a person who's going to try to establish his own or consolidate and strengthen his own political bona fides so as to be the Prime Minister of Japan for some period to come. And Emma, final thoughts from you?
Well, I'll just say in terms of this anxiety about the U.S. election in Japan, first of all, I've been around long enough to know that this happens every time. And, you know, the Japanese were very concerned about Hillary Clinton becoming president when she was running in 2008 because of a Bill Clinton slight, you know, in the 90s. Deeply concerned about her foreign policy article. And then as Secretary of State, they loved her, you know, and we're looking forward to her possibly being president because of her record in Asia. So, you know, this goes round and round. I mean, you know, the Japanese have a lot of anxiety about these things. I do think that, I mean, that's great if Japan, you know, Trump's reelected and Japan thinks that they have a good relationship with him. I think that's going to be difficult to maintain through cost-sharing negotiations. And I think if Biden is elected, he has an emphasis, you know, in foreign policy on sort of reaffirming multilateral institutions and alliances. And if Suga is the kind of worker that he seems to be, and I actually once, years ago, when he was chief cabinet secretary, I was in Japan, jet lagged, up at 5 and decided to go for a run. I think I was staying at the Okuda or something, and literally almost collided with him as I went out for the run. So he was like headed to the Okuda for a 5:30 a.m. meeting with somebody. So it seems that bears out. One other thing, the report that is referenced here has been updated modestly after Suga was actually elected. So there's another version of that out there on that website. And one last thing, if you haven't seen the NHK video from last night of them interpreting the presidential debate here, you have to see it. It's like 3 Japanese women, because always, you know, the interpreters are always women, trying to do the same thing that 3, you know, white men on the stage are doing, like screaming at each other. So it's very entertaining. And
They do it in live time, or was it tape delay?
Simultaneous, but they still have the sound in the background of the actual debate. And these women clearly, I mean, God bless them, you know, that they're even like trying to keep up with this. But I think it's highly entertaining, particularly for the bilingual in the bunch.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for that video plug, Emma. We appreciate it. Thank you to Emma Chanlett-Avery, Shinju Fujihira at Harvard, Emma here in DC at CRS. We deeply appreciate your insights. Thank you for all of our audience joining this discussion of the leadership transition underway and in Japan and what it means for the U.S.-Japan relationship and for Japan and the world. Stay tuned for future Capitol Hill policy dialogues by the Mansfield Foundation. They will be up advertised on our website, mansfieldfdn.org. And we are adjourned for the day. Thank you so much. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.